She found her preacher husband wearing diapers, but what she saw next beneath them was something no one could have imagined. Who was he really, and how deep did his secrets run? As the walls of their seemingly perfect life begin to crumble, one woman will uncover a truth so dark it could destroy everything and everyone she thought she trusted. Grace Miller had learned how to smile on cue. She did it every Sunday morning, standing beside her husband at the front of the church, hands folded, eyes lowered, the perfect pastor's wife. From the outside, her life looked like a blessing: a white house near the river, a respected husband, a congregation that trusted him without question. Inside, the silence had been growing heavier for years. Pastor Daniel Miller was known as a man of discipline. His sermons were calm, measured, and filled with warnings about temptation, weakness, and obedience. People admired the way he spoke about sin, as if he had mastered it himself. Grace once admired that too. Now she wondered what kind of man needed so much control over everyone else. At home, Daniel followed routines with unsettling precision: dinner at 6, prayer at 7. Lights out by 10, Grace moved through the house like a guest, careful not to disrupt the order he insisted was God-centered. Affection had slowly disappeared, replaced by lectures about purity and restraint. When Grace reached for him at night, he would turn away and say fasting strengthened the spirit. Lately, new habits had surfaced. Daniel locked doors that had never needed locks before. He insisted on doing his own laundry, snapping when Grace offered help. Some nights, he disappeared into the guest room for hours, claiming extended prayer. Grace tried to silence the questions forming in her mind, telling herself doubt was a sin. One evening, while Daniel was away counseling a church member, Grace cleaned the study. She noticed a faint chemical smell lingering near his desk. As she bent to empty the trash, her fingers brushed against a drawer she had never seen open. It was locked. Her chest tightened. Daniel had never locked anything from her before. She straightened quickly when she heard the front door open. Daniel's footsteps were faster than usual, his voice sharp as he called her name. Grace stepped away from the desk, heart racing, unsure why guilt flooded her veins. "Did you touch anything in here?" Daniel asked, his eyes scanning the room. "No," Grace said, the lie slipping out too easily. He studied her for a moment too long, then nodded. "Good. Some things are not meant to be disturbed." That night, Grace lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing, slow and controlled. She stared at the ceiling, replaying his words, "not meant to be disturbed." The phrase felt less like guidance and more like a warning. When Daniel finally fell asleep, Grace slipped quietly from the bed. She stood in the hallway, staring at the darkened study door. Her hand hovered inches from the handle. She told herself she was imagining things, that faith required trust. But as she turned away, she heard a faint metallic click from inside the study, like a lock being checked. Grace froze. In that moment, she understood something had already gone terribly wrong. She returned to bed, but sleep refused to come. Images flickered behind her closed eyes: the locked drawer, Daniel's rigid stare, the smell she couldn't place. By morning, the house felt unfamiliar, as if walls had shifted overnight. At breakfast, Daniel prayed longer than usual, squeezing her hand until it hurt, thanking God for order, secrecy, and strength. Grace smiled again, because that was what she had learned to do. As he left for the church, she noticed a small key taped beneath his coat. Her stomach dropped, knowing that whatever the key unlocked would answer her doubts, and that opening it would change everything forever that night completely. Grace waited until Daniel's car disappeared down the street before allowing herself to breathe. The house felt hollow in daylight, stripped of the authority his presence imposed. She replayed the image of the key taped beneath his coat, the quiet certainty that it belonged to the locked drawer tightening in her chest. She told herself not to touch it. She told herself many things lately. Over the next few days, Grace began noticing details she had once ignored. Daniel woke earlier than usual, already dressed when she stirred. He showered alone with the door locked, steam fogging the hallway mirror long after he finished. When Grace asked gentle questions, he answered with scripture, his tone patient but dismissive, as if curiosity itself were a flaw she needed to repent. The laundry became another boundary. Daniel carried his clothes to the basement himself, returning with empty hands and a warning not to go down there. He said mold had spread along the walls, dangerous to breathe. Yet Grace never smelled dampness, only the same faint chemical scent she had noticed in his study. It clung to the house, subtle but persistent, like a memory she couldn't shake. At church, Daniel's sermons sharpened. He spoke of hidden sins, of people who smiled while rotting inside. His eyes seemed to find Grace in the pews whenever he mentioned betrayal. Congregants nodded, murmuring agreement, unaware of the weight each word carried. Grace felt exposed, though she didn't know why. One afternoon, while dusting the hallway closet, she found a cardboard box tucked behind winter coats. Inside were disposable gloves, antiseptic wipes, and sealed plastic bags. Her hands trembled as she replaced the lid. None of it made sense. Daniel wasn't sick. He hadn't said he was hurt. The secrecy felt deliberate, rehearsed. That night, Grace tried to talk to him. She mentioned the locked doors, the late nights, the distance between them. Daniel listened without interruption, his face calm, almost kind. When she finished, he took her hands and prayed aloud, asking God to cleanse her of doubt and anxiety. His grip tightened as he spoke, fingers pressing into her skin until her pulse throbbed beneath them. Afterward, he kissed her forehead and told her she was safe. Grace lay awake long after, staring at the dark ceiling, realizing how small the word safe felt in his mouth. The package arrived 3 days later. It was left on the porch in the early afternoon, plain brown cardboard with no return address. Grace noticed immediately that the name on the label wasn't Daniel's. It read D. Mills, close enough to be intentional, far enough to deny. She stood over the box for several minutes, heart pounding, listening for footsteps that never came. Finally, she carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table. The tape peeled back with a tearing sound that echoed. Inside were neatly folded adult diapers, sealed in plastic. Grace staggered back as if struck. Her thoughts raced, grasping for explanations that wouldn't come. Medical, no prescriptions, no doctors. No conversations, only secrecy, control, and shame. She repackaged the box exactly as she found it, hands shaking. When Daniel came home, he went straight to the porch, then to the basement, without a word. That night, Grace lay beside him, awake, listening as he rose quietly from the bed and padded down the hall. She waited, then slipped after him. The guest room door was open, light spilling onto the carpet. Grace held her breath and stepped closer, unaware that what she was about to see would strip everything away forever. Grace stood frozen in the hallway, the guest room light spilling across her bare feet. Daniel's back was to her, shoulders squared, movements deliberate. He had changed into clothes she did not recognize, loose and pale, laid out with ritual care. On the bed beside him sat the open package from earlier, plastic crinkling softly as he worked. She watched as he lifted one of the diapers, unfolding it with practiced hands. Her first instinct was disbelief, then shame for watching, then fear. This was not illness, there was no fumbling, no hesitation. Daniel moved as if following instructions he knew by heart. Grace leaned closer to the doorframe, pulse roaring in her ears. Daniel stepped into the garment and secured it, checking the fit in the mirror. His face was calm, almost serene, lips moving in silent prayer. The sight cracked something open in her chest. The man who preached mastery over the flesh now wrapped himself in secrecy. She whispered his name before she could stop herself. Daniel stiffened. He did not turn around immediately. When he did, his eyes were sharp, assessing, already calculating what she had seen. He asked her why she was awake, why she was spying. Grace tried to speak, but the words tangled together, heavy with confusion and hurt. "It's not what you think," he said, voice measured. "This is discipline." Grace shook her head. Discipline for what? Daniel approached her slowly, palms open, pastor and husband merging into something unfamiliar. He spoke of purification, of submission, of removing pride through controlled humiliation. He said God required sacrifices the weak could not understand. Grace felt the room tilt, his language wrapping around her like a net. She backed away as he reached for her. "Please," she said, the word breaking, "just tell me the truth." For a moment, something flickered across Daniel's face. Anger, fear, relief. He sighed and turned back toward the bed. "If you're going to watch," he said quietly, "then watch." He unfastened the diaper. Grace's breath caught. Beneath it were dark, deliberate marks etched into his skin, symbols cut and healed over, layered with fresh wounds that had not yet closed. Lines crossed his thighs and lower abdomen, careful and symmetrical, as if mapped. The chemical smell made sense now, sharp and clean. She pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from screaming. The marks were not random. They were intentional, repeated, hidden. Evidence of rituals carried out in secret rooms under the cover of prayer. Daniel turned toward her, eyes glassy. "You see," he said, "this is obedience." Grace stumbled back into the hallway, heart hammering, the world narrowing to the sound of her own breath. She wanted to run, to call someone, anyone, but fear rooted her in place. Daniel followed, his voice low, coaxing, warning. "You can't tell anyone," he said. "They wouldn't understand. They would destroy us. Us." The word felt obscene. He reached out and closed the guest room door, then slid the lock into place with a soft click. Grace flinched at the sound, realizing how many locks there were, how many she had ignored. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "You were never supposed to see this," he said. "But now that you have, we need to be careful." Grace stared at him, seeing not her husband, not a man of God, but a stranger bound to secrets she could not carry. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked steadily, marking time she no longer trusted. As Daniel took her arm and guided her back toward their bedroom, Grace understood the discovery was only the beginning, and that whatever he was hiding had already claimed more than her marriage. The hallway lights dimmed behind them, and Grace sensed unseen witnesses, secrets breathing in the walls, promising consequences that would soon reach beyond faith, love, and safety for everyone involved. Grace did not sleep. The bed felt like a stage where she was expected to play a role she no longer understood. Daniel lay beside her, breathing evenly, as if the night had ended cleanly. When morning came, he acted gentle, making coffee, touching her shoulder, thanking God for endurance. Grace watched his hands, remembering what they had hidden. She spent the day in fragments. When Daniel left for the church office, she moved through the house with new eyes, cataloging locks, doors, smells. The guest room was spotless, stripped of evidence, but the air still carried antiseptic sharpness. She followed it to the basement, heart pounding, ignoring the warning he had given. The basement lights flickered on, revealing shelves lined with plastic containers, folded cloths, and notebooks stacked with obsessive neatness. On a work table sat bottles, gloves, and clean blades arranged like instruments. Grace understood then that this was not a private struggle but a system, practiced and perfected. She opened one notebook. Inside were dates, scripture verses, and meticulous notes describing punishment, progress, and reward. Some entries were marked completed. Others were blank, waiting. Her hands shook as she turned pages and realized the language shifted between first and second person, as if instructions were meant to be followed by someone else. A sound from upstairs froze her. Daniel's voice drifted down, calm, calling her name. Grace hid the notebook under her sweater and climbed the stairs slowly. Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her, his expression unreadable. He asked where she had been. She told the truth and waited for the explosion that never came. Instead, he smiled sadly. He spoke of devotion misunderstood, of burdens carried alone. He said the world punished men who listened too closely to God. He said Grace was lucky to be trusted with the truth. You're part of it now, he said, whether you want to be or not. Grace told him she was afraid. The word felt small but honest. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice, explaining how fear could be shaped, how obedience brought peace. He asked her to keep his secret, reminding her of the church, their reputation, her place. The manipulation settled around her like fog. That evening, Grace pretended calm while planning escape routes in her mind. She packed nothing. She memorized schedules. She watched Daniel carefully, noting how often he checked locks, how his patience thinned when routines shifted. When night came, Daniel asked her to pray with him in the guest room. Grace followed, dread tightening her throat. The room was clean, bare, the bed perfectly made. Daniel closed the door behind them. He knelt and began to speak softly about obedience and sacrifice. Grace noticed the floor was marked with faint scratches, as if furniture had been moved repeatedly. She took a step back. Daniel rose and met her gaze. "This room keeps us safe," he said. He reached for the lock and turned it. The click echoed. "You were never supposed to see this," he whispered, "but now you belong to it." Grace realized then that what he was hiding was not only pain, but control, and that leaving would require more than courage. The door stood between her and freedom, and it was locked from the inside. Daniel waited for her answer, eyes searching her face for surrender. Grace nodded because nodding kept her alive. Inside, something hardened. She memorized the room, the lock, the smell, the cadence of his voice. She knew silence would be temporary, that truth would demand a reckoning. When he finally released the lock and guided her out, Grace understood the next step was inevitable. She would make him speak. She would force a confession, even if it shattered everything they pretended to protect. The night swallowed her fear, and she prepared herself to listen, record, survive, and wait for the moment he finally confessed. Grace waited 3 days before she forced the truth into the open. 3 days of careful silence, of nodding at prayers and answering questions with soft obedience. She slept lightly, listening for footsteps, memorizing patterns. Daniel noticed the change and mistook it for acceptance. That was her first advantage. On the 4th night, she asked him to talk. They sat at the kitchen table after midnight, the house hushed, lights dimmed low. Daniel folded his hands as if preparing for a sermon. Grace watched his face, searching for cracks. She told him she could not carry the fear anymore. She said she needed to understand what God required of him and why. Daniel studied her for a long moment, then stood and locked the back door. "What I'm about to say," he began, "cannot leave this house." Grace nodded. Her heart pounded, but her voice stayed steady. Daniel spoke slowly, choosing words with care. He said the rituals began years ago, during a period of spiritual weakness. He described receiving signs, feeling called to purge himself through discipline and controlled suffering. He said humiliation stripped pride, that pain sharpened devotion. The diapers, he explained, were tools, symbols of submission, reminders of humility. Grace listened, bile rising in her throat. "It wasn't enough," Daniel continued. "I needed accountability." Her breath caught. Accountability from who? He hesitated, just long enough to confirm her fear. "There is someone else," he admitted, "someone who understands." Grace felt the room tilt. She asked if it was a doctor. "A counselor." Daniel shook his head. "A member of the church," he said quietly. "Someone I was guiding." The words landed like stones. Grace pressed her palms flat against the table to keep from shaking. Daniel rushed to explain, his voice urgent, reassuring. He claimed there was no physical intimacy, only spiritual correction. He said the person needed structure, punishment, release. He said she trusted him completely. Grace asked her name. Daniel did not answer immediately. He poured himself water, hands trembling now. If you know, he said, you become responsible. Grace leaned forward. Tell me. Rebecca, he said. Rebecca Hayes. The name meant nothing at first, then everything. Grace pictured the quiet woman who sat alone near the back pew, eyes downcast, always lingering after services. The realization burned. Grace stood abruptly. You used her. Daniel stood too. I saved her. He spoke of Rebecca's trauma, her need for guidance, her willingness to submit. He said she volunteered, that she was grateful. He said Grace could never understand because she lacked faith. Grace felt something inside her fracture. She saw the pattern clearly now, the way Daniel selected weakness and wrapped it in scripture, the way obedience replaced consent. You hurt her, Grace said. Daniel's expression hardened. You're exaggerating. Grace told him she had seen the notebook, the marks, the system. Silence filled the kitchen. Daniel's shoulders sagged. When he spoke again, his voice was cold. Then you know enough to ruin lives, he said, including your own. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. He reminded her of vows, of reputation, of consequences. He said Rebecca depended on him, and exposure would destroy her. He said the church would never believe Grace. Someone else knows. He added suddenly, someone involved. If you speak, it won't just be me who suffers. Grace stared at him. Who else? Daniel did not answer. Instead, he reached out and took her hands, squeezing hard. We can control this, he said, together. Grace pulled free. In that moment, she understood the confession was incomplete by design. Daniel had revealed only what he could shape, only what kept power in his hands. That night, as Daniel slept, Grace lay awake replaying every word. Rebecca's face hovered in her mind, fragile and trapped. Grace knew the truth was larger than she feared, and that silence now made her complicit. As dawn crept through the windows, Grace made a decision she could not undo. She would find Rebecca, and she would learn what Daniel had not confessed yet. Grace began with the church records. She told Daniel she was volunteering more, reconnecting with the congregation. He approved, pleased by what he saw as renewed devotion. He did not notice how carefully she watched, how she listened for names spoken softly, for absences explained too quickly. Rebecca Hayes lived alone in a small apartment near the edge of town. Grace learned that from a prayer request sheet, handwritten months earlier. Rebecca had asked for guidance, strength, forgiveness. The language felt familiar now, coded in the same words Daniel used at home. Grace drove past the building twice before parking, heart hammering. The door opened only a few inches when Grace knocked. Rebecca's face appeared in the gap, pale, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Recognition flickered, then fear. Grace introduced herself gently, saying only that she needed to talk. For a moment, Rebecca seemed ready to shut the door. Please, Grace said, I know about Daniel. The door opened wider. Inside, the apartment was sparse, curtains drawn tight. Rebecca sat across from Grace on a worn couch, hands clenched in her lap. She spoke slowly at first, testing each word. She said Daniel helped her when no one else would. He listened. He gave structure to her chaos. He told her pain was a language God understood. Grace asked about the sessions. Rebecca's voice trembled. She described rules, punishments, rewards. She said Daniel called it discipline, said it would heal her shame. She admitted she wore diapers too, that humiliation was part of the process. Tears streamed down her face as she said she thought it was her fault when it escalated. He said I needed it. Rebecca whispered. He said I asked for it. Grace reached for her hand, feeling the weight of complicity press down on her chest. Rebecca flinched at the touch, then relaxed, gripping Grace's fingers tightly. Grace asked if anyone else was involved. Rebecca hesitated. There were others. She said, not like me. They watched. They learned. Grace felt cold spread through her limbs. Daniel had not been alone. This was not a secret kept between two people. It was a system sanctioned and shared. Rebecca looked up suddenly. "He knows you're here," she said. "He always knows." Grace's phone vibrated in her pocket. Daniel's name lit the screen. Grace silenced it without answering. Rebecca began to cry, rocking slightly, repeating that she wanted it to stop, that she tried to leave, but Daniel said God would punish her. Grace promised she would help, though she did not yet know how. As Grace stood to leave, Rebecca grabbed her sleeve. "If you tell," she said, eyes wide, "he'll make it worse." Grace nodded, understanding the threat was real. She left the apartment shaken. The afternoon sun too bright, too normal. In her car, she finally checked her phone. 3 missed calls, 1 voicemail. Rebecca's voice filled the speaker, panicked and breathless. "He came back." She said, "He's angry. I shouldn't have talked. I shouldn't have." The message cut off abruptly. Grace stared at the screen, dread pooling in her stomach. She tried calling back. No answer. She started the car, hands shaking, knowing whatever Daniel was hiding had already crossed a line she could never ignore. As she pulled onto the road toward Rebecca's apartment, Grace understood the truth was no longer just hers to uncover. Someone was in danger, and time was already running out. Grace arrived at Rebecca's apartment to flashing lights and unanswered questions. The door stood open, a police officer blocking the entrance, telling her it was a welfare check gone wrong. Rebecca was alive, they said, taken to the hospital, unstable and refusing to speak. Daniel arrived minutes later, wrapping an arm around Grace as if to steady her, thanking God loudly for mercy. He never met Grace's eyes. By Sunday, the story had changed. From the pulpit, Daniel spoke about deception, about Satan wearing familiar faces. He did not name Grace, but the congregation turned toward her anyway. Whispers followed her through the aisles. Women who once hugged her now offered tight smiles. The elders asked her to step aside from volunteer work, gently, prayerfully, as if protecting her from herself. At home, Daniel became soft and relentless. He told Grace she was exhausted, imagining threats, misremembering conversations. He reminded her Rebecca was fragile, prone to fantasy. He said the hospital confirmed it. He said Grace's fear came from pride. Each sentence was scripture, apt doubt, repeated until Grace questioned her own memories. She started keeping notes, hiding them inside a cookbook, dates, times. Words Daniel used. She recorded sermons, too, the way his messages shifted whenever she resisted. Control disguised as care, power disguised as love. Writing steadied her when the walls felt closer. Rebecca vanished from church. Daniel explained she needed rest. Grace called the hospital and was told no patient by that name was admitted. When she confronted Daniel, he smiled patiently and asked why she enjoyed creating drama. The smile frightened her more than anger would have. The elders summoned Grace to a meeting. They spoke about submission, about protecting the ministry. They asked if she had been taking her medication, a question she did not remember answering before. Grace realized Daniel had been preparing this ground long before she stepped into the guest room. That night, Grace searched the church after hours. She moved through offices and classrooms, guided by instinct more than plan. Behind the sanctuary, she noticed a section of wall paneling slightly misaligned. It gave when she pressed. Inside the narrow space, she found a leather-bound journal wrapped in cloth. Her hands shook as she opened it. The first pages were Daniel's writing. The later ones were not. Different handwriting, different voices, confessions, rules, punishments, names abbreviated, dates recent. A dark stain spread across several pages, stiff and unmistakable. Grace closed the journal as footsteps echoed down the hall. She slid it beneath her coat and stepped back into the light, heart pounding. Whoever else had known about Daniel's system was still nearby. And they were watching. Grace slipped out through the side door and did not look back. In her car, she locked the doors and sat shaking, the journal heavy on her lap. Her phone buzzed with messages she did not open. She drove without headlights for a block, then pulled over and breathed until the panic eased. At home, Daniel was waiting. He asked where she had been. He touched her cheek and said the elders were worried. Grace nodded, offering nothing. She hid the journal beneath loose floorboards in the closet and showered until the water ran cold. Later, she replayed a recording from her phone. Daniel's sermon, the pauses, the emphasis, the coded permission. She compared it to the entries, to the names reduced to initials. One set matched, the stain matched too, smeared across a final page marked with a date circled twice. A knock sounded at the door. Grace froze. When she opened it, no one stood there. On the mat lay a single glove, powdered and clean. Her phone rang, a blocked number. She answered. A woman whispered, crying. "He's watching the church," she said. "He keeps the book there." The line went dead. Grace held the phone, staring at the door in silence now. Grace did not sleep that night. She sat on the floor of the closet with the journal in her lap, a flashlight cupped in her palm, listening to Daniel's breathing through the bedroom wall. Each page felt heavier than the last, as if the book itself resisted being opened. The early entries were orderly, almost gentle. Daniel wrote about calling, obedience, and trust. He described shaping broken spirits through structure, rewarding submission, correcting defiance. Scripture threaded every paragraph, verses twisted into justification. Grace felt sick reading how carefully he framed control as compassion. Then the handwriting changed. Rebecca's words appeared halfway through, smaller, uneven, crowded into margins. She wrote about fear, about wanting to stop, about believing pain meant progress. She wrote that Daniel said God spoke through him. Grace's chest tightened as she read sentences crossed out and rewritten, as if Rebecca had been coached even in confession. Later entries included initials Grace didn't recognize. Brief notes followed each session. Compliance improved, resistance corrected, discipline increased. One page listed supplies, another detailed cleanup. Grace's hands shook so badly she had to pause, pressing the book against her knees to steady herself. At the back, the tone shifted again. The writing grew frantic, ink smeared where tears or blood had soaked the paper. A final entry ended mid-sentence, the page torn as if ripped away in a hurry. Grace recognized the date. It was the night Rebecca left the voicemail. Grace closed the journal and swallowed hard. This was no longer suspicion or intuition. It was evidence. At dawn, she hid the book inside a canvas bag beneath the passenger seat of her car. She waited until Daniel left for an elders' meeting, then drove to the police station. Her hands trembled as she filled out forms, explaining fragments, watching skepticism flicker across the officer's face. He listened politely, but Grace sensed the doubt forming. When she offered the journal, his expression changed. They took it for analysis. They asked about Rebecca. They asked about Daniel. Grace answered everything she could, voice steady despite the fear clawing at her ribs. When she left, no promises were made, only careful words about procedure. By afternoon, Daniel knew. He called her repeatedly, messages shifting from concern to anger to prayer. When she didn't answer, he came home early. Grace watched from the kitchen as he searched the house, movements sharp and precise. When he reached the closet and found the floorboard loose, he went very still. That night, Daniel confronted her calmly. He said she had betrayed him. He said she had misunderstood sacred work. He said the authorities would ruin innocent lives. Grace told him she knew about the others, about the journal at the church, about Rebecca. For the first time, Daniel raised his voice. He accused Grace of hysteria, of vengeance, of being influenced by evil. He said the police would see through her. He said Rebecca was unstable and unreliable. Then he smiled. They already questioned her, he said softly. She doesn't remember much. Grace felt the room spin. Daniel leaned closer, lowering his voice. You should rest, he said. This will pass. That night, Grace packed a bag and slept with her phone in her hand. Just before dawn it rang. A detective's voice was tight and urgent. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "we need you to come in. Rebecca Hayes has been found alive, and she's asking for you." Grace closed her eyes, knowing the truth was finally breaking through. And Daniel would not survive it unexposed. Grace arrived at the hospital before sunrise, the air crisp and biting as she approached the entrance. She carried the journal in a sealed envelope, tucked under her arm, and her nerves vibrated with every step. Inside, she was calm, precise, determined. Outside, her hands shook, and her chest felt as if it were being compressed by fear and anticipation. The nurse led her to a small private room where Rebecca sat, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, eyes red but alert. When Rebecca saw Grace, her expression softened, a mix of relief and terror. Grace knelt beside her, careful to keep her voice low, steady, comforting. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now. I'm here." Rebecca exhaled, shivering, and whispered fragmented words about Daniel, about obedience, about the rituals. Her story filled the gaps Grace had feared, confirming the worst. Daniel had systematically manipulated, controlled, and humiliated her under the guise of faith. The details were horrific, methodical, and intentional. Rebecca cried quietly, sometimes muttering prayers she no longer believed as Grace listened, recording everything on her phone for evidence. After several hours, a detective entered. He had reviewed Grace's journal, spoken to hospital staff, and traced Daniel's interactions with Rebecca. He looked at Grace with a mixture of caution and respect. "We need you to be precise," he said. "Everything in order, no detail too small. We can't leave him room to manipulate the story." Grace nodded, steadying herself. She recounted the encounters, the packages, the notes, the locked doors. Rebecca corroborated each point, her voice gaining strength as she realized she was no longer alone. Every detail chipped away at Daniel's carefully crafted facade. When Daniel discovered the hospital had contacted Grace, he panicked. Calls came rapidly, alternating between sweet reassurance and thinly veiled threats. Grace refused to answer, her resolve hardening. She realized his control depended entirely on fear and secrecy. Now that secrecy was collapsing. The detective leaned closer. "He'll try to discredit you. He always does, but he's already lost. The journal, Rebecca's testimony, your notes. It's airtight." Grace felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The confrontation she had feared for months was inevitable. That evening, Daniel arrived at their home unexpectedly. Grace stayed calm, hiding her growing sense of strategy behind a neutral expression. He questioned her, his tone shifting unpredictably between tender concern and icy accusation. He demanded to know why she had gone to the hospital, who had been involved, and whether she had shared his secrets. Grace only answered when necessary, careful not to provide him new ammunition. As he left, Daniel warned her one final time, "If you speak, they'll destroy everything. You, me, her. Even the church. Be careful who you trust." Grace watched him leave, silent, knowing his words were meant to intimidate, but that the power had shifted. Late that night, Grace reviewed her recordings, organizing them into a coherent timeline. Every confession, every ritual, every mark on Rebecca's body became part of a pattern too clear to deny. She realized that Daniel's manipulation extended far beyond her home. The web of secrecy, abuse, and false piety stretched into the church, into the community, and it would take every ounce of courage to unravel it. She sent an encrypted message to the detective, attaching the recordings and the journal photos. Then she sat back, exhaling, finally allowing herself to feel the first tremors of hope. Daniel could no longer hide. The silence that had allowed him power for so long was breaking, and justice, slow, deliberate, unstoppable, was coming. As dawn approached, Grace stared out the window at the quiet streets. Somewhere in that darkness, Daniel was plotting, scheming, unaware that his empire of control was collapsing from the very truth he had tried to bury. And she knew with certainty that the next confrontation would decide everything. The courthouse smelled of polished wood, stale coffee, and tension. Grace sat in the front row, hands clenched around the journal that had once haunted her. Daniel's presence across the room was almost theatrical. Calm, composed, the perfect pastor on display for the congregation, the press, and the jury. He smiled at familiar faces in the pews, ignoring the growing weight of evidence against him. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecution laid out a timeline so precise it was difficult to deny. The packages, the secret sessions, Rebecca's testimonies, Grace's recordings, the journal entries. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of manipulation, abuse, and psychological control. The word diapers was spoken carefully in court, but the horror it conveyed hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. Daniel's defense tried to frame Grace as unreliable, suggesting her emotions had clouded her memory. They claimed Rebecca's statements were influenced by suggestion, that fear had distorted reality. But the judge allowed the recordings, the photographs, and the handwritten journal entries. The room was tense as the court listened to Daniel's own words, taken directly from his confessions. Grace watched him closely. His confidence faltered each time a recording played, each time a page from the journal was read aloud. His calm demeanor cracked in private moments, his lips tightening, his eyes flicking toward Grace with something between anger and fear. The congregation gasped when Rebecca testified in person, recounting the humiliation, the control, and the relentless psychological abuse. The courtroom felt charged, as if the walls themselves were judging him. Witnesses came forward. Former parishioners, friends of Rebecca, even some members of the church who had suspected Daniel's manipulations. Each story revealed how far his influence had reached, how carefully he had masked cruelty as guidance. Grace felt a mix of shame, relief, and vindication. She was no longer silent. The world was finally listening. During cross-examination, Daniel tried to twist the narrative, claiming divine intent, spiritual guidance, and protection. He spoke of obedience and faith, insisting that all actions were sanctioned by God. His words sounded hollow against the weight of evidence, yet for a brief moment, Grace feared the jury might still be swayed. The final day of testimony brought Daniel to the stand. He faced the accusations directly, and for the first time he faltered. Under the scrutiny of the prosecutor, confronted with his own words and the trauma of Rebecca and Grace, his carefully constructed persona began to unravel. He stammered, repeated himself, and then, in a moment of rare honesty, admitted he had manipulated and controlled, claiming misguided intentions but acknowledging harm. The jury deliberated for hours. Outside the courtroom, Grace waited in silence, the journal resting on her lap. She thought of Rebecca, of the months of fear and secrecy, of the nights spent listening and documenting, knowing the end of this trial would determine not only Daniel's fate, but the possibility of healing for those he had harmed. When the verdict was finally read, the word guilty echoed through the room. Daniel's face remained composed, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed a crack in the facade. Grace felt a wave of relief wash over her, tempered by the knowledge that the after building lives, reclaiming faith, and facing lingering consequences would take years. Outside, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the congregation murmured among themselves. Grace held the journal tightly, feeling the weight of truth finally acknowledged. Justice had been served, but the story was far from over. As she walked past the courthouse steps, she knew Daniel's influence had extended farther than anyone realized, and that uncovering it fully would require courage, persistence, and unwavering honesty. One chapter had ended, but the work of exposing the network of lies and protection he had built was only beginning. The next step was clear: the hidden evidence, the remaining accomplices, and the truths Daniel had desperately tried to bury needed to surface. And Grace was determined to see it through. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving Grace standing near the judge's bench, the weight of months pressing down like a storm. Daniel was led away in handcuffs, his calm, composed mask replaced by a hollow stare. He had pleaded guilty to multiple charges, each one backed by the journal, the recordings, and the testimony of Rebecca and others. Justice had been served, but it came with a price. Outside, the sun hit the courthouse steps with a harsh glare, and Grace shielded her eyes, blinking against the brightness. Reporters crowded the area, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted. How did he manipulate the congregation? How did the church not notice? Grace answered carefully, choosing words that conveyed truth without endangering Rebecca or others still at risk. She spoke of courage, documentation, and the importance of breaking silence. Back home, the house felt alien. Every lock, every door, every scent reminded her of months spent under Daniel's control. She packed away the remaining journals, evidence, and items connected to his manipulations. The diapers, the notebooks, the ritual implements. Everything had been catalogued for the authorities. Nothing remained that could be used against her or anyone else. Grace sat alone in the living room, feeling the absence of his presence as both relief and grief. Her marriage was over not just because of betrayal, but because the foundation had been built on fear and lies. She realized how deeply her trust had been violated, and the realization carried a pang sharper than any courtroom verdict. Rebecca called that evening. She was quiet at first, hesitant, but relief and a tentative joy filled her voice. She said she was beginning to heal, to reclaim control over her life. Grace promised support, knowing that some wounds were too deep for words, too layered for explanations. Together, they discussed therapy, legal follow-ups, and slowly reintegrating into the lives Daniel had tried to dominate. News outlets followed the trial closely, and the story spread beyond their town. People expressed shock, anger, and disbelief. The church fractured as members confronted their blind trust and the betrayal they had overlooked. Some leaders resigned quietly, while others attempted damage control. Grace understood that exposing Daniel had consequences beyond their home, shaking the entire community's perception of authority and faith. Yet justice carried its shadow. Some congregants defended him, citing devotion and faith, refusing to believe the evidence. Social media threads erupted in heated debate. Grace read them, heart aching for those misled, realizing the ripple effect of one man's deception was far larger than she could ever have imagined. Late that night, Grace walked through the empty house. She paused at the guest room door, the room that had once been a cage of secrets. She touched the handle lightly, feeling the finality of Daniel's absence. The room was still, quiet, a testament to the darkness that had once lived there and the courage it had taken to dismantle it. Justice had been achieved, but the cost was clear. Families were fractured, reputations destroyed, trust shattered. Grace understood the truth of Daniel's manipulations. Evil could hide in plain sight, cloaked in authority, faith, and charm. But now, truth had been unearthed, and freedom, fragile though it was, had been reclaimed. As she sat in the darkened living room, journal in hand, Grace made a silent vow to protect the innocent, to hold perpetrators accountable, and to ensure that the silence which had empowered Daniel would never again take root. Outside, the first hints of dawn broke over the horizon, a reminder that even after the darkest night, light could return, but only when courage demanded it. The past could not be undone, but the future was hers to shape. And for Grace, that truth, hard, stern, and heavy, was worth every cost.